Have you ever noticed how some people can shift the energy of an entire room without saying a single word? They don't argue. They don't explain. They simply stand up and walk away. And when they do, something collapses, not because they were loved, but because they were being used effectively. Machiavelli understood this better than anyone. The strongest move isn't confrontation. It's disappearance. The art of vanishing without a trace. Imagine this. Everyone is performing, talking, begging to be heard, grasping for attention. And then one man says nothing. He stands, he leaves. No protest, no warning, just gone. The moment the door closes, the silence feels like an earthquake. What they lost wasn't him. It was the illusion of control over him. That is power. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that vanishes without explanation, without guilt, without needing to be understood. So ask yourself, what would collapse in your life if you simply stopped reacting? Would they miss you or just the grip they had on you? They didn't need me. They needed control. The brutal truth about predictability. Predictability is enslavement. And when you become unreadable, you're no longer a comfort. You're a threat. But here's the question that echoes louder than any voice. What happens when your first move isn't to fight, but to vanish? Because when your silence is sharpened, your absence becomes power. Men who dominate without raising their voice. There are men who dominate without ever raising their voice. They don't chase validation. They don't defend themselves. They simply disappear. And when they do, the room fractures, not from violence, but from confusion. Because when silence is intentional, it becomes the loudest disruption. Machiavelli understood power doesn't always show itself. Sometimes it just exits, and in doing so, it exposes everyone still performing. The moment you rewrite the hierarchy. Imagine this. A man sits quietly, surrounded by noise, ego, performance, people talking over each other, trying to impress, dominate, entertain. He watches, he waits, then he rises. No announcement, no salt, no need to justify. He simply walks out, and in that moment, everyone else freezes. Not because he was central, but because he became inaccessible. And inaccessibility rewrites the hierarchy. Ask yourself, what would happen if you stopped being easy to reach? Would they respect you more or collapse without your attention? Here's the truth. They don't depend on your presence. They depend on your predictability. You say yes. You explain. You respond. You perform. Just enough to keep them comfortable. But the moment you break the script, the whole system crashes. Because all they ever knew was how to manipulate your need to be understood. Machiavelli's warning. A ruler must learn not to be good. Machiavelli once said, a ruler must learn not to be good when goodness becomes weakness. So next time you withdraw, don't do it to be polite. Do it to break the illusion. Every time you said yes when you meant no, you gave them something, not kindness, not compassion. Every apology you whispered just to avoid conflict. Every message you replied out of fear of being misunderstood. That wasn't connection. It was programming. Control doesn't begin with force. It begins with fear. Machiavelli would tell you, control doesn't begin with force. It begins with your fear of disapproval. They never needed chains. They only needed you to be terrified of being seen as cold, rude, distant. And the moment you feared being misjudged more than being manipulated, they owned you. They didn't love you. They triggered you. They figured out your emotional codes, the exact buttons to press. A vague message, you panic. A cold reply, you spiral. A delayed answer, you chase clarity. And every time you respond, you confirm one thing, I'm still reachable. That's all they needed. Control doesn't scream. It whispers through your compliance. How many of your reactions were actually choices? Ask yourself, how many of your reactions were actually choices? How many were performances just to keep peace? Because here's the brutal truth. They weren't depending on you. They were depending on your reflexes, your guilt, your need to be liked, your obsession with not being misunderstood. The line that feels dangerous to say. Comment below. I owe no one an explanation. If that line feels dangerous to say, it means you need it more than anyone. Because once you stop reacting, They have no playbook left. Machiavelli warned. He who shapes another's expectations rules them without ever touching them. Who are you when no one's watching? Now ask yourself, who are you when no one's watching? When there's no applause to earn, no approval to win, no script to perform. Look in the mirror. Do you see yourself, or the version of you that was trained to be accepted? The one who smiles when something dies inside, replies instantly, not from confidence, but from panic, agrees to keep the peace, even when your instincts scream for war. Machiavelli would call that a survival persona, not designed for truth, but for safety. And every time you wear it, you abandon something sacred. The mask replaces you. You laugh when you want to confront. You stay when you want to disappear. You nod just so no one says you've changed. But the truth? You didn't stay because you were loyal. You stayed because exile felt like death. Until you realize it's not death, it's rebirth. The mask doesn't just hide you. Over time, it replaces you. Because when you perform long enough, you forget what your own voice sounds like. And in that silence, they win. Not by demanding lies, but by rewarding them. Every time you say yes when your soul screams no, you're not being kind. You're negotiating away your power. Comment below, I'd rather be exiled than erased. Because the longer you perform, the more they own the script of your identity. They never loved you, only what you gave them. They didn't need control you loudly. They just needed you to fear being misunderstood. And you played every scene perfectly. You thought you were maintaining peace, but really, you were auditioning, begging to be chosen again and again. Machiavelli would laugh, because that's not love. That's remote control. The role you were assigned. They never raised their voice. They just waited for you to crack the silence. They built the frame. You filled in the story. And when you finally snapped, they whispered, "See? You're the unstable one." What did you do next? You apologized. You softened your tone. You smiled through the burn. You tried harder. Because deep down, you were afraid of losing the role, even if it was killing you. Comment below, I'm not an actor. I'm the director now. Because until you tear up the script they wrote for you, you're not real. You're just a special effect in a show that was never about you. The one who controls the narrative never needs to raise a sword. Machiavelli once wrote, "The one who controls the narrative never needs to raise a sword." So let the stage go silent. Let them wait. Let them wonder, has the play ended? And when they realize you're not coming back to perform, that's the moment they finally understand who is actually in control. Power isn't loud, it's encrypted. You used to think power was loud. Arguments, comebacks, the final word. You thought if you spoke last, you won. But Machiavelli would say, that's not power, that's theater. True power isn't broadcast, it's encrypted. It doesn't chase the spotlight, it controls the lighting. You thought you were defending your identity, but really, you were offering your energy to anyone who dared disturb you. Because here's the trick they used. They never cared about what you said. They just wanted your focus, your presence, your fire. And every time you reacted, they harvested it. That smirk, that silence, that twisted half joke. It wasn't random. It was bait. And you bit again and again, thinking your voice will restore control. But control isn't reclaimed by noise. It's restored through stillness. Your silence must become a frozen battlefield. That's why the strongest leaders in history never shouted. They waited, cold, calculating. Just like nations during the Cold War. No bombs dropped. Just silence, thick with threat. That's what your silence must become. A battlefield frozen in anticipation, not absence, precision. Ask yourself, what if you stop reacting entirely? Would they still feel powerful? Or would they finally feel the weight of their own insignificance? Comment below. My silence isn't confusion, it's calculation. Because once your silence is no longer emotional, but strategic, you stop being baited. You start baiting. You become the pause they can't interpret, the code they can't decode. And in a world addicted to reaction, that unreadability, that's nuclear. The first victory isn't over your enemies. It's over your urge to be seen. Machiavelli would smile because he knew The man who chooses when to strike usually never has to. Something changes when you stop responding. Not because you're numb, but because you're finally watching. Not from the center, from the shadows. You don't react. You don't plead. You don't perform. You vanish from the battlefield, not as a casualty, but as a commander stepping off the map. Because real power doesn't shout from the stage. It watches from behind the curtain. Machiavelli called this the first victory, not over your enemies, but over the urge to... You ask yourself, did I go too far? Did I become heartless? Was I wrong to withdraw? But Machiavelli would call it something else. Purification. Because silence doesn't isolate you. It filters everything that was never real. They didn't vanish because you became cruel. They vanished because you stopped being easy to consume. They didn't love your essence. They loved your emotional availability, your predictability, your performance. And now that you revoke that, they retreat, not out of heartbreak, out of inconvenience. That empty space they leave behind, it isn't abandonment, it's detox. A brutal burn that clears the parasites from your nervous system. And in that burn, you hear something you haven't heard in a very long time. Your voice, not the one you curated to be understood, not the one trained to appease, not the one that smiled through discomfort, the real one, the raw one, the voice that doesn't beg, doesn't flinch, doesn't apologize for existing. Yes, it's quiet now. Yes, it's cold, but that's not death. That's emergence. If silence feels like punishment, who taught you that noise meant safety? You're not alone. You're finally undisturbed. Ask yourself, if silence feels like punishment, who taught you that noise meant safety? Comment below. This silence isn't emptiness. It's revelation. Because what you're experiencing isn't exile. It's extraction. And what's left after the smoke clears isn't a weaker version of you. It's the version they never wanted to meet. When you stop being easy to reach, people reveal themselves. When you stop being easy to reach, people don't just walk away. They reveal themselves. They say, you've changed. You're distant. You're selfish. But what they really mean is, you're no longer predictable. You're no longer ours. Because when you were always available, they didn't have to value you. They scheduled you. They summoned you. You were convenience disguised as connection. And now your time has weight. Your silence has meaning. Your presence has cost. And they panic, not because you're gone, but because they lost access. Machiavelli's warning. If they never feared losing you, they never respected you. Machiavelli warned. If they never feared losing you, they never truly respected you. So when you say no, watch who flinches. When you go silent, watch who calls you cold. When you stop answering every signal, watch who labels you dangerous. Because to them, you were never a person. You were a utility, an emotional ATM. And now that you close the account, they call it betrayal. But here's the truth. Their love was never unconditional. It was performance-based. It was access-based. It was about control, not connection. Ask yourself, who disappeared the moment you stopped performing? Comment below. My distance is not rejection, it's redirection. Because the ones who remain, they don't chase access. They don't panic at your silence. They respect the gap. They honor the space. They never needed control to stay close. Those few, they are not just safe. They are sacred. Everyone else, let them fall away. Let them call it loss, while you call it alignment. Because when you stop being reachable, you don't become cold. You become clear. The space between who you were and who you're becoming. There's a space between who you were and who you're becoming. It's not peaceful. It's not poetic. It's brutal. Because transformation doesn't whisper. It burns. You're not losing people. You're losing personas, versions of you that existed to please, to entertain, to obey. And now, they're being incinerated. Every time you stay quiet when you once explained, a layer peels off. Every time you hold your ground instead of apologizing, a mask disintegrates. Every time you choose distance over performance, you shed skin. And what's left? Rawness. Silence. Terrifying clarity. It doesn't feel like growth. It feels like exile. But exile is how kings are forged. Because what you're facing is a rejection. It's reconstruction. Machiavelli's final lesson. Men do not rise by addition, but by subtraction. Machiavelli said, men do not rise by addition, but by subtraction. And that's what this is. A burning, not of your heart, but of your history. Ask yourself, what are you still holding on to that only exists to keep you accepted? Comment below. I'm not evolving. I'm erasing the lie. Because this isn't becoming someone. It's unbecoming everything they trained you to be. You are not empty. You are scorched. You are not empty. You are scorched. And from that charred soil, a voice returns, not to explain, not perform, but to command. This isn't loneliness. It's ascension. And the ones who can't handle your silence now were never meant to survive your reappearance. The final silence. Absence is power. You withdrawn. You've gone silent. And yes, they forgot you. But more importantly, you remembered yourself. You don't perform anymore. You don't explain what doesn't need explaining. You don't offer access to those who only knew how to consume you. Machiavelli once wrote, he who no longer needs approval can no longer be ruled. And now, you're untouchable. Not because you raise your voice, but because you mastered the one thing they never could. Absence is power. Silence is decoration. You stop being a presence they could schedule, predict, interrupt. You become something else. A presence they feel even when you say nothing. The final question, who are you when no one is watching? You didn't lose people. You lost performance. You lost the leash. And what remains? Stillness. Sharp, calm, unapologetic. You no longer chase clarity. You no longer bleed to be understood. You no longer confuse access with love. Because now, you become a question they can't answer. A threat they can't trace. A silence they can't fill. Ask yourself, who are you when no one is watching? When nothing is demanded and everything is yours to protect? Comment below. My silence is not escape. It's empire. Because from this moment forward, your voice may fade, but your absence will echo forever. And that is power no one can borrow, control, or kill, not even by loving you.